In the small, quiet town of Ridgewood, life was supposed to be simple. People knew each other by name, kids played freely in the streets, and everyone looked out for one another. But beneath this seemingly peaceful surface lurked a dark secret that had poisoned the heart of the community: corruption within the police department. For years, a group of rogue officers led by Detective Marcus Kane had turned the force into their personal playground. They weren't just bending the rules, they were shattering them. Marcus Kane was a man who commanded respect, or at least fear. With his sharp suits, confident smile, and reputation as a tough but fair cop, he fooled many into thinking he was doing what was best for Ridgewood. But those who dared to cross him quickly learned otherwise. Shopkeepers paid weekly bribes to avoid random inspections. Drivers handed over cash during traffic stops instead of receiving tickets, and anyone unlucky enough to get arrested found themselves facing fabricated charges unless they could pay Marcus and his crew off. The worst part: no one felt safe enough to speak up. The few brave souls who tried were silenced, one way or another. A local mechanic named Joe had once complained about being extorted. His garage mysteriously burned down days later. A young mother reported harassment from an officer, only to have false evidence planted in her home, landing her in jail. Over time, the townspeople stopped trusting the very people sworn to protect them. Fear became the law of the land. One day, things came to a head when Marcus and his team were finally put on trial for allegations of misconduct. It wasn't easy getting them there. Years of cover-ups and threats made sure of that. But a whistleblower inside the department managed to leak documents proving their crimes. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as residents packed the benches, hoping justice would finally prevail. Lawyers argued passionately, witnesses recounted harrowing stories, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the tide might turn. But then came the verdict: not guilty. Cheers erupted from Marcus and his crew, slapping each other on the back like they'd won a sports championship. Their lawyers smirked smugly while the judge dismissed the case, citing insufficient evidence. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Marcus, asking how it felt to beat the odds. He grinned wide, puffing out his chest as if he'd done something noble. "This is proof we're innocent," he declared loudly. "The real criminals are the ones trying to tear us down." For the townspeople watching silently, the celebration stung like salt in an open wound. Parents held their children close, unable to explain why bad men got away with doing terrible things. Some shook their heads in disappointment, others cried quietly, feeling hopeless. Little did Marcus and his crew know, however, that their victory lap wouldn't last long. Unbeknownst to them, someone new was about to step onto the scene. Someone who wouldn't tolerate their games any longer. As Marcus raised a glass to toast his freedom that evening, fate was already setting the stage for his downfall. Victoria Hayes didn't leave Ridgewood with fanfare or grand goodbyes. Instead, she slipped out quietly one early morning, her car packed with little more than clothes, a few mementos from grateful townsfolk, and the knowledge that she had made a difference. The sun was just beginning to rise as she drove away, casting golden light over the sleepy streets of Ridgewood. It was a fitting metaphor for what she'd helped bring: a new dawn after years of darkness. For the first time in months, Victoria allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't naive enough to believe Ridgewood's problems were completely solved. Corruption left scars that took time to heal. But she knew she had planted seeds of change, seeds watered by courage, resilience, and hope. The younger officers she had mentored were already stepping up, determined to lead with integrity. Residents who once lived in fear now spoke openly about rebuilding trust. And though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, Ridgewood was finally on the path to recovery. As she drove, Victoria reflected on her own journey. Coming to this town hadn't been part of any grand plan. It was an opportunity born out of desperation and need. Yet, it had become so much more. It reminded her why she had chosen this line of work in the first place, not for recognition or accolades, but to make a tangible impact. In Chicago, she had been caught in a system too broken to fix. Here, she had found redemption, not through applause, but through action. Her phone buzzed occasionally during the drive, each notification bringing messages of gratitude from people she had touched along the way. A shopkeeper thanked her for freeing him from weekly bribes. A mother shared how her son could now walk home without fear. Even Clara, the journalist, sent a heartfelt note saying, "You gave us our voices back." Each message brought a small smile to Victoria's face, reinforcing what mattered most, making lives better, even if only in small ways. But Victoria wasn't ready to rest. Corruption wasn't unique to Ridgewood. It festered in countless other places, hidden behind badges, suits, and lies. As she pulled into a roadside diner for breakfast, she jotted down notes about her next steps. There were whispers of similar issues in nearby towns, stories of power abused and justice ignored. These weren't just headlines. They were calls to action. And Victoria intended to answer them. By the time she reached her destination, a quiet cabin tucked deep in the woods, Victoria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her sanctuary, a place where she could recharge before diving back into the fight. Sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, she watched the trees sway gently in the breeze. For now, peace surrounded her, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Somewhere out there, another community needed someone willing to stand against injustice, to shine a light in the darkest corners. That night, as stars blanketed the sky, Victoria opened her laptop and began researching her next case. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing names, dates, and locations. She wasn't driven by anger or vengeance anymore. It was something deeper, something purer. Justice wasn't just a career for Victoria, it was a calling. And as long as there were people suffering under the weight of corruption, she would be there, ready to fight. Somewhere far away, a town waited unknowingly for its savior. And Victoria Hayes. She was already preparing to step into the fray once again. Victoria Hayes wasn't the kind of person who shied away from a challenge. In fact, she thrived on them. Once a celebrated detective in Chicago, her career had taken a sharp turn after a scandal involving her former partner. Though she was innocent, the media circus and internal politics forced her out of the department. But instead of letting bitterness consume her, Victoria reinvented herself as an independent investigator. Her reputation for exposing corruption grew quickly. She became known as someone who could dig up the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. When the mayor of Ridgewood reached out to her, Victoria was initially hesitant. The email arrived late one night, filled with vague details about serious issues within the local police department. At first glance, it seemed like just another cry for help. But something about the message caught her attention, a desperate plea hidden between the lines. After exchanging a few encrypted messages and reviewing some preliminary files, Victoria realized this wasn't a typical case. Ridgewood wasn't just dealing with lazy or incompetent cops. It was infested with predators wearing badges. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission. The more Victoria learned, the angrier she became. Stories of shopkeepers being extorted, families torn apart by false arrests, and entire neighborhoods living in fear painted a grim picture. She couldn't ignore the injustice any longer. Accepting the role of interim chief of police, Victoria made a promise to herself. She wouldn't leave until she dismantled the rot at its core. However, she knew walking into Ridgewood blind would be suicide. These officers weren't amateurs. They were seasoned manipulators who'd built walls around their empire. To take them down, Victoria needed to play smart. Her arrival in Ridgewood was unassuming. Dressed in plain clothes, carrying only a suitcase and her determination, she checked into a small inn on the outskirts of town. For days, she observed silently, learning the lay of the land. She visited local diners, struck up conversations with shopkeepers, and listened intently to whispers of anger and despair. People spoke cautiously, glancing over their shoulders even indoors, afraid of being overheard. It broke her heart but also fueled her resolve. On her first official day as chief, Victoria walked into the precinct ready to face her new colleagues, or rather, adversaries. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Marcus Kane leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he already knew she'd crumble under pressure. Other officers exchanged skeptical looks, muttering jokes about city slickers not lasting long in their world. Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, she introduced herself calmly, projecting confidence without arrogance. "I'm here to make sure this department operates with integrity," she said firmly. "Change starts today." Her words earned laughter from Marcus and his crew, but Victoria didn't let it faze her. She spent the next few days studying the inner workings of the precinct, pretending to admire Marcus's leadership while secretly gathering intel. Old case files told stories of planted evidence and coerced confessions. Younger officers, frustrated by the toxic culture, began approaching her cautiously, sharing their concerns. Slowly but surely, Victoria started piecing together the puzzle. Every document, every conversation, brought her closer to the truth. What Marcus and his team didn't realize was that they'd underestimated her. To them, Victoria was just another outsider sent to clean up appearances, a temporary nuisance they could brush off. But behind her calm demeanor burned a fire fueled by justice, and unbeknownst to them, she was already planning her next move. The courtroom was packed to the brim on the day Marcus Kane and his crew faced justice. Citizens of Ridgewood filled every seat, spilling into the hallways and standing wherever they could find space. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. For years, these people had lived under the shadow of fear, silenced by corruption and abuse of power. Now, they were finally getting their day in court, and they weren't going to miss it. As Marcus and his team were led into the room in handcuffs, whispers rippled through the crowd. Gone was Marcus's usual swagger. Instead, he looked pale and defeated, his arrogance stripped away by the weight of overwhelming evidence. Federal prosecutors laid out the case piece by piece, wiretapped conversations from the secret meeting, marked bills recovered during the sting operation, testimonies from victims who had suffered at their hands, and even confessions from lower-ranking officers hoping for leniency. Each revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, punctuated by gasps and murmurs from the audience. Victoria sat quietly in the back row, watching as the truth unfolded. She wasn't there to take credit or bask in glory. This moment belonged to the people of Ridgewood. Every tear shed by a victim giving testimony, every cheer from a resident celebrating justice served, was proof that her mission had been worth it. When the judge delivered the verdict, not guilty but guilty on all counts, the room erupted in cheers so loud they echoed down the courthouse halls. Marcus and his crew were denied bail, declared a danger to society, and escorted out without ceremony. Their reign of terror was officially over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Victoria, eager to hear her thoughts on the historic victory. But she deflected the attention, choosing instead to highlight the courage of those who had come forward. "This isn't my win," she said firmly, addressing both the media and the gathered crowd. "It's theirs." The people of Ridgewood stood up when it mattered most, and together we showed that no one is above the law. Her words earned thunderous applause, but Victoria remained humble, stepping aside to let others share their stories. In the weeks that followed, life in Ridgewood began to change. Businesses reopened after years of extortion, families felt safe walking the streets again, and faith in law enforcement slowly started to rebuild. Victoria worked tirelessly to ensure the department's transformation continued, implementing reforms and mentoring younger officers determined to do things the right way. She held town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns, listen to updates, and see firsthand how the new leadership prioritized transparency and accountability. Despite offers to stay permanently as chief of police, Victoria declined. She knew her role was temporary, a catalyst for change rather than its caretaker. On her final day, officers lined up to thank her, some shaking her hand while others hugged her tightly. "You saved us," one young officer said, his voice thick with emotion. Victoria smiled warmly, patting him on the shoulder. "I just gave you the tools," she replied. "It's up to you to keep building." Before leaving town, Victoria received heartfelt letters and gifts from grateful residents. A local baker presented her with a cake decorated with the words, "Thank you for justice." Children handed her drawings of police officers helping people, their innocence restored. As she packed her car and prepared to drive away, Victoria took one last look at Ridgewood. It wasn't perfect. It might never be. But it was healing. And sometimes, that was enough. Driving down the open road, Victoria felt a renewed sense of purpose. Somewhere else, another town needed someone willing to stand up against corruption, to fight for what was right even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And she would be. Victoria knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and Marcus Kane and his crew would smell blood, or worse, see through her act. From the moment she stepped into the precinct, she understood that gaining their trust was key to dismantling their empire. So instead of throwing her weight around or demanding immediate changes, she chose a different approach, blending in. She played the part of the clueless outsider, someone who didn't quite grasp the realities of policing in Ridgewood. Her first order of business was observing. Victoria spent hours sitting quietly in the office, watching how things worked, or rather, how they didn't. Officers came and went without much structure, often disappearing for hours at a time. Conversations were hushed but laced with arrogance, especially when Marcus was around. He strutted through the halls like he owned the place, barking orders one moment and laughing loudly the next. His confidence was unnerving, but Victoria saw it for what it truly was, overcompensation. Deep down, Marcus was scared of losing control, scared of being exposed. And fear, Victoria knew, made people reckless. To keep up appearances, Victoria started asking questions. Not direct ones, of course, but subtle inquiries disguised as curiosity. "How do you handle tough cases here?" She'd ask casually during coffee breaks. Or, "What's your secret to keeping the community safe?" At first, the officers brushed her off, assuming she was just another bureaucrat trying to sound smart. But soon, they began opening up, feeding her bits of information about their so-called methods. Marcus, ever the showman, even invited her to join him on a ride-along, eager to impress her with his skills. The ride-along turned out to be exactly what Victoria needed. As they patrolled the streets, Marcus pointed out various shops and businesses, boasting about how cooperative the owners were. "It's all about building relationships," he said with a sly grin, though Victoria caught the thinly veiled threat in his tone. Later, when they pulled over a driver for speeding, Marcus leaned into the car window, flashing a smile before slipping something into his pocket, a bribe, right in front of her. Victoria kept her expression neutral, nodding along as if impressed. Inside, however, her stomach churned with disgust. Back at the station, Victoria continued playing along, pretending to admire Marcus's leadership style. She praised his ability to keep the peace and nodded sympathetically when he complained about difficult citizens. Her acting skills paid off. The officers started warming up to her, treating her less like an outsider and more like one of them. Even Marcus seemed to relax, inviting her to team meetings where plans for illegal activities were casually discussed. Each conversation gave Victoria valuable insight, helping her piece together the full scope of their corruption. But Victoria didn't rely solely on charm. Behind closed doors, she worked tirelessly, reviewing old case files, cross-referencing evidence, and documenting everything. She reached out to victims too afraid to speak publicly, assuring them that change was coming. Slowly, she began forming alliances with younger officers who felt trapped in the toxic environment. These officers, disillusioned by the department's culture, became her eyes and ears, feeding her information while shielding her from suspicion. Despite her progress, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope. One misstep, and Marcus would pounce. Yet, she reminded herself why she was there: to restore justice to Ridgewood. Every snide comment, every arrogant smirk from Marcus only strengthened her resolve. For now, she would bide her time, gathering evidence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Little did Marcus know, the woman he thought was harmless was about to turn his world upside down. As the weeks passed, Victoria's quiet infiltration of the Ridgewood Police Department began to yield results. She had earned just enough trust from Marcus Kane and his crew to avoid suspicion, but her presence was starting to make waves in subtle ways. Officers noticed minor changes, new policies requiring detailed reports for every arrest, stricter rules about evidence handling, and surprise audits of confiscated items. While these measures seemed harmless on the surface, they disrupted the corrupt officers' usual routines. For Marcus, this was a red flag. One afternoon, Marcus cornered Victoria in her office, his usual charm replaced by thinly veiled irritation. "You've been shaking things up around here," he said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, searching for cracks in her calm demeanor. Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled warmly and gestured for him to sit down. "Just trying to bring some structure," she replied smoothly. "We need to show the public we're serious about doing our jobs right." Her words sounded reasonable, even admirable, but Marcus wasn't convinced. To test her loyalty, Marcus decided to invite Victoria to a secret meeting, a gathering of local criminals and corrupt officials where deals were made under the table. It was a risky move. Only those deeply embedded in the network were ever invited. If Victoria accepted, it would prove she was willing to play dirty. If she refused, Marcus could use her hesitation as proof she wasn't one of them. The invitation came casually during lunch, almost as an afterthought. "There's a little get-together tonight," Marcus said with a smirk. "Nothing official, just some friends. You should come." Victoria hesitated, knowing full well what kind of friends Marcus meant. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, a chance to witness their operations firsthand and gather concrete evidence. But she also knew saying yes could put her life in danger. After a brief pause, she nodded, feigning reluctance. "All right," she said, forcing a small laugh. "But don't blame me if I embarrass myself." Marcus grinned, clearly pleased. He clapped her on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Victoria alone with her racing thoughts. That evening, Victoria arrived at the meeting location, a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale smoke, and shadows moved behind makeshift curtains. Inside, a group of men sat around a folding table, counting stacks of cash and dividing bags of contraband. Marcus introduced Victoria as a new ally before launching into discussions about upcoming business ventures. As they talked, Victoria listened intently, memorizing names, dates, and locations. She subtly shifted her phone in her pocket, ensuring the recording app she'd activated earlier captured every word. At one point, a heated argument broke out between two members over territory rights. Voices rose, and tempers flared. Victoria stayed silent, observing how quickly alliances shifted and threats escalated. When someone suggested planting drugs on a rival gang member to frame them, Victoria forced herself to nod along, pretending to agree. Her stomach churned, but she reminded herself why she was there: to expose these monsters for who they really were. By the time the meeting ended, Victoria felt both exhilarated and exhausted. She had gathered more than enough evidence to build a solid case, but she also realized how dangerous this game had become. Back at the station the next day, Marcus boasted about their plans, unaware that Victoria now held the key to dismantling everything he built. As she listened to him laugh and joke with his crew, Victoria allowed herself a small private smile. They thought she was playing their game, but soon they'd learn she was rewriting the rules, and they wouldn't like the outcome. With the evidence from the secret meeting burning a hole in her pocket, both literally and figuratively, Victoria knew it was time to escalate her plan. She couldn't keep playing along forever. Marcus and his crew were too dangerous, too entrenched in their web of corruption. But taking them down wouldn't be easy. These men had spent years building their empire, and they weren't about to let anyone tear it apart without a fight. Victoria needed to act decisively, strategically, and above all, carefully. Her first move was subtle but powerful. She began leaking pieces of information to trusted reporters. Not everything at once. That would risk tipping off Marcus, but enough to stir public outrage. A local journalist named Clara had been quietly investigating the department for months, gathering stories from victims too afraid to speak out. When Victoria reached out to her through an encrypted message, Clara was skeptical at first. But once Victoria shared snippets of recordings and documents detailing the corruption, Clara's skepticism turned into determination. Within days, headlines blared across Ridgewood. Police corruption exposed, and town demands answers from rogue officers. The effect was immediate. Citizens who had long lived in fear started speaking up, encouraged by the growing momentum. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "No more lies," and "Justice for Ridgewood." The once silent town now buzzed with anger and hope. Inside the station, tension crackled like static electricity. Officers whispered nervously in hallways, unsure whether they should side with Marcus or distance themselves. Even some of Marcus's loyalists began to falter, sensing the ground beneath them shifting. Marcus, however, refused to back down. Convinced he could spin the narrative in his favor, he called a press conference. Standing in front of cameras with his trademark smirk, he dismissed the allegations as baseless attacks, meant to tarnish the department's reputation. "We're the ones protecting this town," he declared, pounding his fist on the podium. "These lies are nothing more than a witch hunt." His bravado might have worked before, but this time, the crowd wasn't buying it. Booing erupted from the audience, forcing Marcus to cut the conference short and retreat inside. Back at the station, Marcus confronted Victoria, his usual charm replaced by barely contained fury. "What's going on, Hayes?" he snapped, slamming a newspaper onto her desk. "You think you can come in here and turn everyone against us?" Victoria met his glare with calm indifference. "I'm just doing my job," she replied evenly. "If your conscience is clear, you've got nothing to worry about." Her words hit a nerve. Marcus stormed off, muttering threats under his breath. But Victoria didn't flinch. She knew she'd struck a nerve, and that gave her leverage. Behind the scenes, Victoria worked tirelessly with federal agents to build an airtight case. They reviewed every piece of evidence she'd collected, piecing together a timeline of crimes that stretched back years. Wiretaps were set up, surveillance increased, and warrants prepared. Meanwhile, Victoria implemented stricter policies within the department, ensuring no new illegal activities slipped through the cracks. Every change frustrated Marcus further, chipping away at his control. Finally, the moment arrived. Victoria orchestrated a sting operation using confiscated cash as bait, a setup designed to catch Marcus and his crew red-handed. She convinced Marcus that this was a chance to make one last big score, feeding into his greed. As the operation unfolded, federal agents lay in wait, ready to pounce. When the corrupt officers took the bait, Victoria stepped forward personally to apprehend Marcus, ensuring he couldn't escape. That night, as Marcus sat in handcuffs, his arrogance finally crumbled. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. Victoria watched silently, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about healing a broken system. And though the battle wasn't over yet, she knew Ridgewood was finally on the path to recovery. The night of the sting operation was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Victoria stood in the shadows near an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Ridgewood, her heart pounding but her mind razor-sharp. This was it, the moment she had been working toward since her first day in town. Federal agents were positioned strategically around the area, their radios crackling softly as they communicated in hushed tones. The plan was simple: lure Marcus and his crew into intercepting what they believed was a drug shipment filled with confiscated cash, then catch them in the act. Victoria had spent days planting the idea in Marcus's head, feeding his greed with promises of easy money. "This is your chance to make a big score," she'd said casually during a meeting earlier that week. No strings attached. Marcus, ever the opportunist, bit immediately. He gathered his closest allies, 3 officers who had been part of his corrupt network for years, and devised a plan to seize the cash under the guise of a routine bust. What they didn't know was that every detail of their scheme had been carefully orchestrated by Victoria. As midnight approached, headlights pierced the darkness. A black van pulled up to the warehouse, its tires crunching against gravel. Out stepped Marcus and his team, armed and cocky, expecting an easy payday. They moved quickly, scanning the area before heading inside. Inside the warehouse, stacks of marked bills sat neatly on a table, surrounded by hidden cameras and microphones. Marcus grinned as he ran his fingers over the cash. "This is it," he muttered to his crew. "We're set for life." But just as they began stuffing the money into duffel bags, chaos erupted. Floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the warehouse like daylight. Federal agents swarmed in from all sides, shouting orders to drop their weapons and get on the ground. Panic set in among Marcus's crew. One officer froze, another tried to run, and a third reached for his gun. Before things could spiral out of control, Victoria stepped forward, her voice cutting through the commotion like a blade. "Stand down," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus turned to face her, his expression morphing from shock to fury. "You?" he spat, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You set us up." Victoria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked closer, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You brought this on yourself," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "Every bribe, every false arrest, every victim you destroyed. It ends tonight." Federal agents moved in, handcuffing Marcus and his crew one by one. As they led him away, Marcus struggled against their grip, yelling threats and curses. But Victoria remained calm, watching as the man who once ruled Ridgewood with an iron fist was reduced to nothing more than a criminal in cuffs. It was a surreal moment, almost poetic in its justice. For years, these men had operated above the law, untouchable and unaccountable. Now, they were exactly where they belonged. Once the scene was secure, Victoria took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment sink in. She glanced around the warehouse, now buzzing with activity as evidence was collected and statements taken. Agents thanked her for her bravery and precision, praising her role in bringing down such a deeply entrenched network of corruption. But Victoria didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was still work to be done, loose ends to tie up, and a community to heal. Back at the precinct the next morning, news of the arrests spread like wildfire. Officers whispered nervously in hallways, unsure of what would happen next. Some expressed relief, glad to see the toxic leadership gone. Others worried about repercussions, fearing they might be implicated, despite having played smaller roles in the corruption. Victoria addressed the department personally, standing tall in front of a sea of uniforms. "Change starts today," she declared. "Not just here, but across this entire town. We have a chance to rebuild trust, to show the people of Ridgewood that we're here to serve, not exploit." Her words resonated deeply, especially with the younger officers who had long felt trapped in a system rigged against them. Many vowed to support her efforts, eager to prove they could be better. As Victoria left the room, she allowed herself a small smile. The hardest part was over, but the real work was just beginning. And though she knew challenges lay ahead, she also knew one thing for certain: Ridgewood would never be the same again.